Alright everyone, this is video 2. For this section I chose to do the chapter on prophecy, which again is another topic that I find very fascinating, very interesting. And again, I think Osborne does a different than anticipated job of what I was expecting, but ultimately a good job. When he starts off with this section of prophecy, talks about how prophecy was predominant during the 5th to 8th century BC, particularly. And but of course you had prophets that existed before that. You had, of course, Moses was a prophet. You had Miriam, who was a prophet. Other prophets, of course, existed. Balaam was a prophet as well in the book of Numbers. And so all of these prophets existed prior to this main era of prophecy. He also talks about how in the Hebrew Bible, the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and Kings, both of those books are all considered former prophets. And then, of course, you have the latter prophets, which in our Bibles are the major prophets and the minor prophets during the time of the divided kingdom. But Osborne starts off by talking about how many of the prophets, when they gave their message, focused particularly on the end of the covenant that was established back in the book of Deuteronomy, and talked about how with the end of the covenant coming, that of course meant the dispersion and the end of Judah and Israel, which of course we know from history happened. And of course Judah returned, but Israel never did. So he starts off by talking about first the role of the prophet, what the prophet was supposed to do. Of course, the prophet was called by God, and we're familiar with many of those callings. You see in Isaiah 6 his calling, and Jeremiah, beginning of chapters 1 and 2 of his calling. Even the book of Jonah, it's such a short book, but God's basically just tells Jonah, hey, go to Nineveh and preach. And of course, we know the story. So you typically have this call by God to the prophet. You also have the role of the prophet, which would be, receiving the message from God and communicating it with others. It was also more for reformation than it was for innovation of the time and of the people of the day and era. You also had that it was a preservation of tradition, and that it had a strong focus again on the covenant and on Torah. So that the prophets were trying to bring people back to God. And to bring people back to God was to obey God, was to follow what he had set for them in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, and in the first 5 books of the Bible. And so that was basically the role of the prophet. But you also had the nature of the prophecies that the prophet would prophesy. And of course those existed mainly talking in present and future. And so for a lot of prophecies you have that they are both foretelling and forthtelling. In other words, that they are discussing something that is going on then and there right now, but you also have a future implication. I have a good friend of mine and a mentor who tells me that if prophecy is kind of like looking at a mountain range in a picture. You can see the mountains in the front here, and there's mountains in the back. And of course, there could be a long valley in the middle, but of course, you don't know how long that valley is. If you look at the prophecies of Isaiah and the prophecies in Jeremiah, they affected those individuals of the day and age. But of course, Isaiah's prophecies 700 years later, when Christ came, were fulfilled again. And Jeremiah's, of course, 500 years after. The same thing, Christ fulfilled those prophecies, and you have that through many of the prophecies that, of course, speak of the Messiah, but then you also have other types of prophecies as well. And that's what he gets kind of into next, are the different types of prophecies. You have prophecies of judgment, you have prophecies of blessing and deliverance, there's prophecies that are woes to people and nations. You have even prophecies of apocalyptic nature, such as Zechariah and Daniel and Ezekiel. And you also even have poetry at times that a prophet would lay out. And so Osborne finally concludes the chapter by talking about the hermeneutical understandings of prophecy. And of course, to us, as we've been learning throughout the course, you want to take the prophecies and you want to look at them in their immediate context. And he talks about, determine what the text says. Look at the prophecies themselves as the sentences and as the paragraphs that they are, but then also look at them in the context of the book, the context of the prophet themselves, the context of history. He also says, look at it from a Christological perspective as well. Was this fulfilled in Christ? Was it fulfilled, other times? Is it yet to be fulfilled? And then, of course, we can't take our own theology and put it into what we read in the prophets and say that this means this and this means that. But he just talks about, be very careful with how you interpret it. Let the Bible interpret itself. Don't give your own interpretations through that. And that's basically how prophecy works. And that's how he concludes the chapter on prophecy. So I'll see you in the next video.